Some men spend 40 years building something, a career, a savings account, a quiet kind of dignity. They think that by the time they reach 70, they've earned the right to stop being careful. Newton Hayes was one of those men. He had a mind sharp enough to teach economics for 3 decades and a heart soft enough to believe a stranger in Manila when she told him the future was full of opportunity. He didn't lose his retirement in a casino. He didn't gamble it away at a card table. He handed it over, piece by piece, to a woman who smiled like someone who cared and planned like someone who never did. This is his story. The day I wired the first $45,000, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt excited, not nervous, not uncertain, genuinely, foolishly excited. I remember sitting in my apartment in Cambridge, watching the transfer confirmation appear on my laptop screen, and thinking, this is it. This is finally it. After 32 years of teaching other people about markets and risk and opportunity, I was finally doing something for myself. I was finally taking my own advice. That's the part that still stings the most. I was an economics professor. I taught students how to spot a bad deal. I lectured for 3 decades on the psychology of financial manipulation, on how intelligent people fall for fraud, on how desperation and desire can cloud even the clearest thinking. I wrote a paper once, back in 2009, on affinity fraud and how it targets people who feel socially isolated. I handed that paper to hundreds of students over the years, and then I handed $375,000 to Yara Reyes. Let me start from the beginning, not the very beginning, not Cambridge, not the divorce, not the 3 years I spent eating microwave dinners alone in a 2-bedroom house that felt like a museum of a life I used to have. I'll get there. But first, let me tell you about the conference in Cebu, because that's where everything started, and everything started beautifully. I was invited to speak at an economic development symposium in the Philippines in March of 2022. It was a small conference, maybe 200 attendees, organized by a consortium of Southeast Asian business groups trying to attract foreign investment. I was one of 4 Western academics they'd brought in. I'd been semi-retired for about 2 years by then, doing the occasional guest lecture, some consulting work, nothing heavy. My daughter Patricia had been pushing me to travel more. "You haven't left Massachusetts in 8 months, Dad," she'd told me over Christmas. "You're going to turn into furniture." So I went. I packed 2 blazers and a carry-on bag, and I flew 14 hours to the Philippines, telling myself it was professional, telling myself it was about the work. It wasn't really about the work. I was lonely, I'll just say it plainly, because there's no point dressing it up. My marriage had ended 7 years earlier after 28 years together. My son Marcus lived in Portland, and we talked on birthdays and holidays. Patricia was closer. She called every Sunday, but she had her own life, her own family, her own calendar. I had my apartment, my bookshelves, my morning walks along the Charles River. I had colleagues who respected me and students who remembered me fondly, and none of that fills the quiet of a Tuesday evening when you realize you haven't spoken to another human being since Thursday. I wasn't looking for romance in Cebu. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't one of those men who flew to the Philippines with an agenda. I was just a tired, slightly hollow, 70-year-old man who needed to feel useful again, and the conference gave me that. The first 2 days were genuinely energizing. Good conversations, smart people, interesting panels on regional infrastructure investment and digital finance innovation. And then, on the 3rd evening, At the networking reception, I met Yara. She was standing near the drinks table when I noticed her, not because of anything dramatic, just because she was smiling at something a colleague of mine had said, and the smile was warm and completely unguarded. She looked to be in her mid-30s, dressed professionally, holding a glass of sparkling water. When my colleague introduced us, she shook my hand and said, "Professor Hayes, I actually looked you up when I saw your name on the program. Your paper on affinity fraud is required reading in a few business schools here. I'll be honest. That got me." "You've read that paper?" I said. "Twice," she said. "Once in school, once last year, when a client of mine got caught up in something similar. I used your framework to help them understand what had happened to them." She told me she was a promoter, a business consultant, and events coordinator who connected investors with emerging market opportunities across Southeast Asia. She had a card, a LinkedIn profile, a professional manner that felt entirely credible. We talked for almost an hour that first evening. She asked smart questions about macroeconomic trends. She listened, really listened, the way very few people do when they're talking to someone older. Most people in their 30s look at a 70-year-old man and half listen while they wait for their turn to speak. Yara wasn't like that, or she seemed not to be. When the reception ended, she said, "If you have time before you fly home, I'd love to show you a few projects I'm currently promoting. I think your perspective would be valuable, and honestly, some of them might interest you from an investment standpoint." I said I had one free day before my flight. She said, "Perfect." Looking back now, that word should have been the first thing I noticed, not wonderful or great or let me check my schedule, just perfect, as if she'd already calculated exactly how much time she needed. We met the next morning at a hotel cafe near the waterfront. She came prepared. She had a folder, a tablet, printed materials, everything organized and professional. She walked me through 3 opportunities. She said she was currently promoting to investors. The first was a multi-level marketing wellness company called VitaCore Asia that was expanding across the Philippines and was offering early investor positions with, she said, exceptional returns for seed-level participants. The second was a cryptocurrency platform called Pacific Chain that was, she explained, built specifically for cross-border remittances in Southeast Asia and had already attracted interest from several regional banks. The third was a real estate development near Clark Freeport Zone, a mixed-use residential and commercial property she called Horizon Park that was being positioned as a long-term hold with projected returns of 18% annually. Now, I want you to understand something. I sat across from this woman and I listened to those 3 pitches, and I knew, intellectually, technically, professionally, that every one of those structures had elements that warranted serious scrutiny. The MLM model, the unregulated crypto platform, the off-plan real estate promising double-digit fixed returns. Every alarm bell I'd ever installed in 32 years of teaching economics should have been ringing at full volume. But she was so calm. She was so knowledgeable. She answered my questions precisely. When I pushed back on the MLM structure, she said, "You're right to be skeptical. Most MLMs are designed to extract value from participants rather than create it. VitaCore is different because the revenue model is anchored to actual product sales, not recruitment fees. I can show you the audited financials." When I questioned the crypto platform, she pulled up what appeared to be a Securities and Exchange Commission registration document from the Philippines. When I asked about the real estate developer's track record, she had a folder of completed projects with photographs and testimonials. She had an answer for everything, and she didn't push. That was the thing. She didn't pressure me. She leaned back at one point and said, "Look, Professor Hayes, I'm not here to sell you anything. I genuinely believe in these projects, or I wouldn't be promoting them. But if none of this is the right fit, that's completely fine. I just thought, given your background, you'd find the landscape interesting." I flew home 3 days later thinking about her. Not romantically, not yet. Professionally. She'd given me her contact information, and I'd sent her a polite follow-up email thanking her for her time. She replied within 20 minutes, which, again, I didn't register the way I should have. We started exchanging emails, then video calls. By June, 3 months after Cebu, we were talking 2 or 3 times a week. She would call in the early evening her time, which was my morning, and we'd talk for an hour sometimes, about the projects, about the Philippine economy, about my work, my research, my years in academia. She asked me once about my divorce, and I told her more than I expected to. She listened. She said, "It sounds like you gave a great deal of yourself to your work for a very long time. It makes sense that the personal side of your life felt secondary." It was such a measured, thoughtful thing to say. Not dramatic, not falsely sympathetic, just accurate. By July, something had shifted between us, and I knew it. The calls felt different, warmer, more personal. She started the calls by asking how I was feeling, not by opening a spreadsheet. She remembered things I'd mentioned in passing, that I liked Earl Grey tea in the morning, that I'd been trying to reread Keynes for pleasure and finding it harder than I expected, that my left knee had been giving me trouble since spring. She asked about Patricia. She asked about Marcus. I told myself it was friendship. I was careful about that word. I didn't let myself think anything more than friendship because I was 70 years old and she was in her mid-30s and I wasn't a fool. But I was lonely enough to let the warmth of it fill up all those quiet Tuesday evenings. And that, I think, was where the damage really started. In August, she called with what she described as a time-sensitive opportunity with VitaCore. She said the seed investor window was closing at the end of the month, and she'd been holding a position for me because she believed I was the right kind of long-term partner for it. The entry point was $45,000. The projected return over 3 years, she said, was between 60 and 90%, depending on expansion pace. I asked for the documentation. She sent it within the hour. I spent 2 days reviewing it. Some of it looked very convincing. Prospectuses, registration, certificates, what appeared to be third-party audit reports. Some of it raised questions, but I'd spent enough time talking to Yara by then that I had a running internal translator that converted my doubts into her explanations. That's how it works. I've come to understand. It's not that the fraud is invisible. It's that the relationship makes you want to find reasons to believe. And I was very good at finding reasons. I wired $45,000 on August 19th. Yara called that same evening. She said, "I want you to know that I take this seriously. This isn't just a transaction to me. I feel responsible for how this performs for you." She sounded almost emotional when she said it. I remember thinking, this woman genuinely cares. I remember feeling grateful. The first few months were quiet. She sent me monthly updates, PDF documents showing account growth, reinvestment activity, projected milestones. Everything looked orderly. I was getting comfortable. In November, She introduced me to the Pacific Chain cryptocurrency opportunity. She framed it differently this time, not as a separate pitch, but as something D been wrestling with whether to bring to me. Normally, I wouldn't suggest crypto to someone with your investment philosophy, she said, but Pacific Chain is genuinely different. It's not speculative, it's infrastructure. She explained that the platform was designed to facilitate overseas worker remittances, a massive market in the Philippines, and that the token was backed by an actual transaction volume, not speculation. She said early investors would receive a share of transaction fees. As the platform scaled, the ask was $80,000. I hesitated. I told her I needed to think about it. She said, "Of course, take as long as you need. I just want you to have the information." She didn't follow up for 10 days. When she did, she didn't mention Pacific Chain at all. She just called to talk. We talked for an hour about a journal article I'd been reading, and about her nephew who was applying to university, and about whether I'd considered visiting Manila sometime. That last part. Have you considered visiting Manila sometime? It was casual, offhand, but it landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to land, and I think she knew it would. Because by then I had thought about visiting. I had thought about it a great deal. I had thought about what it would be like to sit across from her at a real table in a real cafe instead of on a laptop screen, and I'd told myself very firmly that that kind of thinking was foolish. But I was lonely enough to wire $80,000. 2 weeks later, I want to stop here for a moment and say something to anyone who might be listening to this and thinking, how? How could someone that educated, that experienced, miss all of this? I've asked myself that question every single day for the past 18 months. And the honest answer is, it wasn't about intelligence. It was about isolation. Loneliness is a kind of hunger, and when you're hungry enough, you stop tasting things carefully. You just eat. By the time I transferred the Pacific Chain money, I had also agreed to visit Manila in January of the following year. Yara had suggested it originally as a business trip. She said she wanted to introduce me to the Horizon Park developers in person, walk me through the Clark site, show me what the real estate project actually looked like on the ground. "It'll give you confidence," she said. "Seeing the actual land, meeting the actual team, that's worth more than any prospectus." I booked my flights. I told Patricia I was going back to the Philippines for a consulting engagement. I didn't tell her about the investments. I hadn't told anyone about the investments. Looking back, that silence was the most damning thing. I'm a man who spent his career teaching transparency and due diligence. I've told students 100 times, if you can't tell the people who love you what you're doing with your money, that's a sign something is wrong. I knew that. I just didn't apply it to myself. Manila in January was warm and loud and overwhelming in the best possible way. Yara met me at the airport. That was the first time I saw her in person since Cebu, and something about seeing her standing there in the arrivals hall. Practical clothes, no drama, just a genuine smile, made everything feel more real and more right. She shook my hand, helped with my bag, and said, "Welcome back. I think you're going to like what I show you." We spent 3 days together. She took me to a co-working space in Makati where, she said, the VitaCore regional team operated. There were people at desks, phones ringing, a wall of branded signage. It looked like a real business. She introduced me to a man named Dindo, who she described as the platform director for Pacific Chain, a friendly, technically articulate man in his 40s who walked me through what he called the platform's transaction dashboard on a large monitor. The numbers looked impressive. I asked a few questions. He had smooth answers. On the second day, she drove me to a site near Clark, a large flat piece of land surrounded by construction fencing with architectural renderings printed on boards at the entrance. A man named Ferdy, who she introduced as the Horizon Park project liaison, shook my hand and gave me a brochure and pointed at patches of land and described future buildings. He had hard hats and site maps and a confident manner. On the third evening, Yara took me to dinner at a rooftop restaurant in BGC. The city was spread out below us, all lights and traffic and the low hum of a place in motion. We ordered too much food and drank San Miguel and talked until almost midnight. At some point, I don't remember exactly when, she reached across the table and put her hand briefly on mine when I was saying something about my marriage, about how strange it felt to have built a life with someone and then have the architecture of it just quietly collapse. She didn't say anything. She just let her hand rest there for a moment. I didn't say anything either. When she pulled her hand back, she said quietly, "I think you deserve a second chapter, Newton. I genuinely believe that." She used my first name. She'd been calling me Professor Hayes for 5 months. The switch was small. It shouldn't have meant anything, but I was 70 years old and sitting on a rooftop in Manila with a woman who seemed to see something in me worth investing in, and it meant everything. I came home from that trip and wired $120,000 into the Horizon Park project within 2 weeks. That brought my total to $245,000, more than half my liquid retirement savings. Patricia called one Sunday in March, a few weeks after I got back, and she asked, out of nowhere, "Dad, are you doing anything with your investment accounts?" I was looking at some tax stuff with my accountant, and he mentioned something about offshore transfers possibly needing to be reported. I told her I'd moved some funds into international diversification, nothing to worry about. She paused and said, "Are you sure? Can we talk about it?" I told her I was sure. I changed the subject. That was the moment I should have stopped. Patricia asking meant something had leaked. Some instinct on her part, some number she'd noticed, some shift in the way I'd been talking. She was always perceptive, my daughter, sharper than I gave her credit for. But I didn't stop because Yara had just sent me a new update. VitaCore was showing a 31% increase in regional sales, and Pacific Chain had just completed what she called a liquidity event that had doubled the value of early investor positions on paper. She sent me what appeared to be a portfolio statement. It showed my combined holdings at approximately $318,000. I had invested $245, and the statement showed $318,000. On paper, I was up $73,000. On paper, everything was working. The next ask came in April. Yara called and told me that VitaCore was launching a new product line, a health monitoring device, and that they were offering existing investors a priority position in the production funding round. The opportunity was $95,000 for a 15% stake in the device line, with a projected buyout or licensing deal within 18 months. She said she was putting in $20,000 of her own money. She said she'd only brought it to 3 investors she trusted completely. I told her I needed to think about it. I called my old colleague from Cambridge, a man named Professor Gerald O.C., who'd spent years working in development finance, not to tell him everything, but to float the structure hypothetically. I described the VitaCore model without names and asked what he thought. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Newton, the product funding round structure you're describing is a classic bridge between a Ponzi and a straight-up capital raise fraud. The fact that they're offering existing investors priority access is a retention mechanism. It's designed to keep you from withdrawing your principal by giving you a new reason to stay in." He said it matter-of-factly, the way you say something to a colleague you respect enough to be direct with. I thanked him and hung up. And then I transferred $95.00 to Yara's designated account the following week. I cannot explain that fully. I've tried. Part of it was stubbornness. I didn't want Gerald to be right, because if Gerald was right, then I had already lost $245,000 and I couldn't face that. Part of it was hope, the hope that if I stayed in, if the next one worked, I could recoup everything and walk away whole. And part of it, the part that shames me the most, was that I didn't want to stop talking to her. I didn't want to pull the thread that unraveled the relationship, because by then it wasn't just about the money. It was about the dinners and the late calls and the hand on the table in BGC and the way she said, second chapter, like she meant it. The calls continued through May and into June. Then in late June, something shifted. The calls started getting shorter. She was very busy with a new set of clients. The updates on the portfolio came later, then stopped arriving on the usual schedule. When I asked about the Pacific Chain liquidity statement I'd been expecting, she said there had been a regulatory review that had temporarily frozen reporting, but would clear within 2 weeks. 2 weeks came and went. In July, I asked directly about my VitaCore balance. She sent me a document. It looked different from the previous statements. The header formatting was slightly different. The font had changed. I didn't say anything, but I noticed. In August, I asked if I could begin a partial withdrawal. I told her I wanted to pull out $50,000 just to cover some home repairs and to reassure myself that the funds were liquid. She said she understood completely and that she would initiate the process. She said it would take 3 to 4 weeks due to the way investor positions were structured. 4 weeks passed. No transfer. I called her. She answered, sounding strained, and told me there had been a compliance issue with the outgoing transfer that was being resolved. She said, "Newton, I am working on this personally. Please trust me." There was something in her voice that I hadn't heard before. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of tightness, like someone reading from a script they don't entirely believe. I told her I needed the money within 2 weeks. She said, "I'll do everything I can." She stopped answering her phone 10 days later. I sent emails. I sent messages on every platform. I called the number listed for VitaCore's Makati office. A recorded message said the number was not in service. I searched for the Pacific Chain SEC registration document she'd sent me, the one that had looked official, and I found a forum post on a crypto watchdog site where someone had posted the same document and identified it as a template available for download, not a real registration. The document number didn't exist in the SEC database. I hired a local attorney in Manila, a man recommended to me through an expat legal referral service, a patient, careful man named Adi Ramos, who had handled fraud cases involving foreign nationals before. He investigated quietly over about 6 weeks. What he found came back to me in a written summary that I read sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in October, and I read it 3 times before I fully understood what I was looking at. Vita Core Asia was a shell. It had no registered products, no audited financials, no legitimate operation. The Makati office I'd visited existed. It was a rented co-working space that multiple groups had used for exactly this kind of demonstration. Dindo, the platform director for Pacific Chain, was not a technology executive. Pacific Chain itself had no verifiable blockchain infrastructure, no transaction volume, no registered token. The Clark construction site, the land I'd stood on with Ferdy and his hard hats and his site maps, was real land owned by a legitimate developer who had no connection whatsoever to a project called Horizon Park. Ferdy was not a liaison. He was a hired actor. The architectural renderings had been purchased from a design stock site. Yara Reyes was a promoter, exactly as she described herself. She promoted fraudulent investment schemes to foreign nationals, primarily at business conferences and expat networking events. She was one of several people operating what Addie Ramos described as a coordinated syndicate targeting Western investors. She had done this before. There were at least 2 other foreign investors Addie Ramos knew of who had similar experiences. My total loss, $375,000. Gone, all of it. The Vita Core investment, Pacific Chain, Horizon Park, the product line round, every dollar. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after I put down the summary. The morning light was doing something ordinary through the window. Just light, just a Tuesday, and I kept thinking about that paper I'd written in 2009 about affinity fraud, about how it works not by tricking the intellect but by exploiting the heart, about how intelligent, educated, experienced people fall for it precisely because they are intelligent enough to rationalize and experienced enough to be tired of being alone. I'd written all of that. I'd explained all of that to students who were 22 years old and theoretically far more naive than me. And none of it had made the slightest difference when it was me sitting across the table from a woman who listened like she meant it and remembered how I liked my tea. I called Patricia that evening. I told her everything. There was a long silence on the line after I finished, and then she said, very quietly, just that, just my name. And I heard in it all the things she was too careful to say. The worry, the love, the grief. I told her I was okay. She said, I'm coming this weekend. I told her she didn't need to. She came anyway. Marcus called 2 days later. He was less measured about it. He said, how did this happen? You're an economics professor. And I said, I know. He said, we need to involve the FBI. I said, I already have. I'd filed a report with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center and ATI. Ramos had filed parallel complaints with Philippine authorities. Whether anything would come of it, he'd been honest enough to tell me, was uncertain. International fraud recovery, he said, was difficult. He did not say impossible. He didn't say anything to give me false hope either. I appreciated that. There was one more call I had to make. A week after I told the children, I called Professor Gerald Osei. I told him what had happened, the full picture. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, I'm sorry, Newton. I should have pushed harder in March. I told him it wasn't his job to push harder. It was my job to listen, he said. We're taught to believe that knowledge protects us, that if we understand the mechanism, we're immune to it. It doesn't work like that. The mechanism exploits everything we are, including our knowledge. He paused, and then he said, don't let this be the last chapter. I've thought about that a lot. Don't let this be the last chapter. The recovery, financial recovery, is essentially impossible. Addie, Ramos has been clear about that. Fraudulent proceeds of this kind are moved quickly, often across multiple jurisdictions, and by the time any legal process reaches the point of asset recovery, the money is long gone. The $375,000 is gone. My retirement as I had imagined it, the slow years of reading and traveling, and perhaps, yes, finding some version of connection again, that version no longer exists. I'm 70 years old, and I have to rebuild something from whatever remains, and some days that feels insurmountable, and some days it just feels like the next problem to solve. What I've tried to understand in the months since October is not what she did. That part is clear enough. What I've tried to understand is what I did. Not to punish myself. I've done enough of that. But because understanding it is the only useful thing left. I was an economist. I understood the fraud intellectually from the first conversation. But Yara understood something I didn't account for. That intellectual understanding means almost nothing when the emotional conditions are right. She didn't need to fool my mind. She needed to make me feel something specific: warmth, recognition, the sense of being seen, and then give my mind enough material to work with so it could rationalize what my heart had already decided. She was very good at both. The conferences, the credentials, the professional manner, those were the material. The listening, the remembering, the hand on the table in BGC, those were the conditions. And I provided the rest myself. I provided the loneliness and the need and the stubborn hope that at 70 years old, there was still someone out there who found me worth the time. She used that. She used it systematically, and I am not angry about that in the way I expected to be. I am sad about it. I am deeply, quietly sad about what it means. That something as ordinary and human as wanting not to be alone can be turned into a vector for harm. That the very openness required to connect with another person is exactly what makes the connection dangerous. I've started seeing a therapist here in Cambridge. Her name is Dr. Whitfield, and she is direct and competent, and she does not allow me to be sentimental about what I lost without also being honest about what I contributed. It is uncomfortable work. It is, I think, the right work. Patricia visits more often now. She doesn't say much about the money. She said what she needed to say once, and then she let it go, which is a kind of grace I don't take for granted. She brings groceries sometimes, and we eat together and watch something on television, and it's ordinary in a way that feels like medicine. Marcus has softened too. He called last month just to talk, not about the fraud, not about the FBI case, just to talk. We spoke for almost an hour. I don't know when that last happened. Gerald Ossie has been sending me articles, things he thinks I'd find interesting. He sent one last week about regulatory developments in Philippine financial markets, and I read it carefully and sent him back 2 pages of notes, and he replied with 3 pages of his own. And for that hour, I felt like myself, the version of myself that had something to contribute. The version that wasn't just a cautionary tale. I am writing this, speaking this, because I want it on record, not for sympathy, not for warning exactly, though if it helps someone, then I'll take that. I'm writing it because silence felt like the only option for a long time, and silence is what she counted on. People who run these schemes count on shame. They count on men like me, educated, proud, privately desperate, being too embarrassed to say what happened. They count on the humiliation of the gap between who we think we are and what we actually did. I'm closing that gap, slowly, imperfectly, one uncomfortable conversation at a time. I taught economics for 32 years. I wrote about fraud. I understood the theory of exactly what happened to me, and I lost $375, zero to a woman who knew that understanding something in the mind means nothing if you haven't done the harder work of understanding it in the gut, in the chest, in the place where the loneliness lives. That's the lesson. That's the one I should have been teaching all along. The rooftop in BGC is still there, probably. The lights are still on. The city still hums. The San Miguel still tastes the same. Somewhere in Manila, Yara Reyes is sitting across from someone new, asking smart questions, remembering small details, reaching across a table at exactly the right moment. I hope that man, whoever he is reading something like this. I hope he is less certain of his immunity than I was. I hope he calls the people who love him before he wires the money, not after. And I hope when he gets home, someone comes that weekend without being asked. That part, at least, I got right in the end.